Good morning. This meeting will come to order. This is a public meeting of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. I'd like to welcome members of the public and market participants, as well as those on the phone or watching on our webcast. I'd also like to welcome my fellow commissioners, Commissioner Quintens, Commissioner Benham, Commissioner Stump, and Commissioner Berkovitz. As we did at the last open meeting, I'd like to begin today with the Pledge of Allegiance. Anyone is welcome to join. It's a good reminder of the oath of office each one of us took when we joined the CFTC. We're all here to work together on behalf of the American people. We just concluded Hispanic Heritage Month, and the theme was the many contributions of Hispanic Americans in public service. I'd now like to invite representatives of our Hispanic Affinity Group to lead us in the pledge. Norma Ruiz and Herminio Castro, please come to the front. Or you can stand where you are. That's perfect. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. We'll now begin with opening statements. I'll go first, then followed by my fellow commissioners in order of seniority. Today we gather to consider two measures, both of which involve the margin rule for uncleared swaps. The margin rule is important because it requires that certain market participants post initial and variation margin. This reduces counterparty risk across our swaps markets. I want to thank staff in the Division of Swap Dealer and Intermediary Oversight, along with staff from the offices of the Chief Economist and General Counsel, for their hard work in preparing both rule proposals. Specifically, from DSIO, Josh Sterling, Warren Gorlick, Carmen Moncada-Terry, and Rafael Martinez. First, we're proposing a rule to extend by 1 year the compliance deadline for Phase 5 of our margin rule. Phase 5 will subject many small entities to initial margin requirements for the first time. In the U.S. alone, this will expand the number of in-scope entities from 40 to over 700. As a result, we understand this phase could require documenting and operationalizing nearly 7,000 initial margin relationships. Recognizing the operational complexity of this undertaking, the FDIC and the OCC recently proposed a similar 1-year extension. This follows the Basel Committee and IOSCO calling for the same extension. I fully support today's proposal to provide that same relief. Without this extension, there could be market strain and disruption. We could find ourselves in a situation where numerous counterparties are shut out from the uncleared swaps markets. That could harm liquidity and price discovery. We don't take this decision lightly. Initial margin is an important safeguard against counterparty credit risk. But here we're only talking about roughly 3% of the total notional amount subject to this requirement. Given that, I believe the proposed extension will mitigate rather than exacerbate risk to market participants. The second proposed rule we're voting on would exclude the European Stability Mechanism from the definition of financial end user. Under our current regime, financial end users, in contrast to commercial end users, are generally required to post initial and variation margin. However, we've recognized that some of those financial end users should be excluded for public policy reasons. This has included foreign governments and multilateral development banks. Similar to those entities, the ESM is an important intergovernmental agency that supports Eurozone economies by making loans, purchasing bonds, and shoring up member state banking systems. In July of 2017, CFTC staff recognized the important role ESM plays in the European financial system. Our staff granted no action relief from the margin rule for unclear swaps involving the ESM. If today's proposal is adopted, that provisional relief would be made permanent. I also note that the ESM has been granted relief from our clearing requirements. It's also my intention to propose permanent relief for clearing in the near future as well. The global nature of our derivatives markets requires regulators to work together. Only then can the G20 reforms promote financial stability while fostering economic growth. And now I'd like to recognize my fellow commissioners for their opening statements. Commissioner Quintens?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling today's meeting and for the work of the staff in the development of these two proposals, both of which I think target one of the key post-crisis reforms of adding margin to uncleared swaps. And I'm going to support the first proposal today, which provides smaller entities with an additional year to come into compliance with the uncleared margin requirements, which I think is appropriate given both their scope and their impact in the market, but also I think during a time where these entities and the entire financial system are dealing with the consequences of a potential Brexit, as well as LIBOR transition and new data reporting requirements. I believe it's appropriate to give some flexibility in the implementation of these standards. However, as I'm going to explain later, I believe maybe during the consideration of the rule, I'm going to respectfully dissent from the proposal to exclude the ESM from margin requirements for uncleared swaps. But if I could, let me quickly discuss my thoughts around Phase 5. As our own chief economist noted, Phase 5 is going to bring approximately 700 entities into our margin regime, implicating around 7,000 relationships that would have to be negotiated to manage initial margin requirements. Recognizing those operational challenges, BCBS and IOSCO revised the uncleared margin framework to include an additional implementation phase. I'm pleased that the agency, consistent with this revised international framework, is providing these smaller counterparties with additional time to come into compliance. I also support the recent proposal by the U.S. banking regulators to similarly extend the compliance period for smaller firms. However, in my opinion, much more needs to be done. First, it is critical that the CFTC, U.S. banking regulators, the SEC, and our international counterparts adopt a coordinated approach with respect to uncleared margin. As we all know, the derivatives market is a global market, and any differences in our respective approaches will result in increased burdens and operational complexities for firms. This point was emphasized most recently and fairly emphatically at the recent GMAC meeting sponsored by Commissioner Stump. Participants there highlighted the numerous ways in which derivatives regulators across the globe have implemented conflicting timing, scope, calculation, and other requirements for uncleared margin implementation. I believe we must work with our regulatory counterparts to eliminate these cross-border discrepancies. Today's rulemaking represents a first step of many more in that international harmonization effort, and I will continue to support the work of Commissioner Stump and GMAC to further align and rationalize the uncleared margin frameworks globally. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Benham.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this meeting. First off, I want to thank the staff for all your work on the two proposals. I will be supporting both proposals today, and I'd like to mention, I'll make a statement as we deliberate each on their own, but as a larger matter, I'd like to point out that both of these rules sort of elucidate a lot of important things that I think we as a commission do on a daily basis, and many of the things that both the chairman and Commissioner Quintens mentioned, but most notably coordination both domestically and internationally. Margin is a pillar of the post-crisis reforms, and I will be supporting that proposal because I think it's important for us as an agency and as a community of regulators to be flexible where needed, but also firm so that we stick very strictly and in a disciplined manner with what was set out nearly a decade ago after the crisis. In addition, formalizing no action relief, something that I've discussed many times and I know is a priority for the chairman. No action relief can leave many of our market participants with uncertainty. And although it was justified in my view for many years at the onset of the Title VII implementation, it's good to see that we're starting to address some of these outstanding no action relief letters that advocate good policy and certainly can be finalized in a formal manner. So with that, I look forward to the discussion. Thanks again to the staff for all of your hard work. And of course, thank you to the chairman for holding this meeting.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Benham. Commissioner Stump.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Regarding the exchange of the initial margin for non-centrally cleared derivatives, I believe we are today taking a prudent step to amend our regulations in coordination with regulatory bodies both here in the United States and around the globe. There are an unprecedented number of market participants coming into scope in the last implementation phase of the margin requirements, and I want to take the opportunity to point out and thank the Office of the Chief Economist for their work in helping us get our hands around exactly statistically what we're talking about. So thank you to OCE. In recognition of the unique challenges presented by the last implementation phase, the BCBS and IOSCO worked together to ensure that this phase could be staggered and extended. And today we are simply taking steps to amend our own regulations to effectuate that implementation extension to September 1st, 2021. For those entities with smaller average aggregate notional amounts of swaps. In supporting this proposal, I would note that the deadlines we set often have a knack for surprising folks sooner rather than later, and at some point prolonging the finish line is not an option. That said, I'm supportive of the extension, both for the benefit of the market and the benefit of the regulatory agencies tasked with addressing the unique challenges presented by this final phase. During the recent meeting of the Global Markets Advisory Committee, which I am honored to sponsor, we learned that in addition to the tremendous operational challenges that market participants faced, regulatory parameters more suited for the counterparties involved in earlier implementation phases may need to be refined for the application of this final phase. These issues were so vast that the committee determined to recommend the creation of a subcommittee that can advise the Commission on considerations to prudently address these challenges. I am hopeful that such a subcommittee will be up and running soon so that we can assist the Commission in better determining how to prudently apply our regulations to this final phase. Additionally, the Commission is today proposing to expressly carve out from the definition of financial end user the European Stability Mechanism, such that uncleared swaps between covered swap entities and the ESM are not subject to the CFTC's margin rule. In doing so, we note that Europe has already determined to exempt the ESM under their own margin rules for OTC derivatives not cleared by a central counterparty. I believe that today's proposal is an expression of respect by the CFTC for our European colleagues, and I will be supporting both proposals. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Stump. Commissioner Berkovitz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone, and I'm happy to be at another public meeting once again. I'm very much supportive of doing our business in the public and engaging in discussions amongst ourselves and with the staff in public so that the public can see our deliberations and understand what we're doing. Even though it's a rainy day, this is government and sunshine. We can bring a little sunshine to a rainy day here in Washington. I also would like to thank the staff, as well as including the Secretariat. And I know you were working late last night even to get the versions right, to get technical corrections all corrected, and appreciate us getting the very latest thinking and working diligently to provide the most accurate drafts in a timely manner. So at the risk of a spoiler alert here, I will say I'm going to vote for both proposals. I'll get into a little more detail as we discuss each one of them, and I've got more detailed statements. I would like to note at the outset, though, on the extension of the margin deadline for the smaller entities, to look at not the glass half empty, but the glass half full in terms of these deadlines. And it's actually not even half empty or half full. It's essentially 97% full. We're only talking about 3% of the aggregate notional amount here for which we're extending the deadline. And while that 3% still could be very significant, and we should still be concerned about getting everybody into the initial margin, what we're really talking about is a one-year extension on that 3%, which affects a lot of smaller end users. So 97% of the deadline is going to stay in place with what we're doing here today, and I think it's important to put in context. And that's a very important accomplishment, which I think we should all be very proud of, and also commend the marketplace and the market participants for putting in the necessary agreements or working towards putting in the necessary agreements, which they will have to do. So I'm going to support both proposals, and I think that they're justified under the circumstances, and look forward to the further discussion. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Commissioner Berkowitz. For each of the items on today's agenda, the staff will make presentations to the Commission. After each presentation, the floor will be open for questions from each of the Commissioners. Following the close of discussion on each matter, the Commission will vote on the recommendation. All final votes conducted in this public meeting will be recorded votes. The results of votes approving the issuance of rulemaking documents will be included with those documents in the Federal Register. To facilitate the preparation of the proposed approved documents for publication in the Federal Register, I'd now ask the Commission to grant unanimous consent for the staff to make necessary technical corrections prior to submitting them to the Federal Register.
So moved.
Without objection, so ordered. At this time, I'd like to welcome the DSIO staff for their presentation on the proposed rule extending the compliance schedule for Phase 5 entities.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, good morning. This is my first appearance at an open meeting of the Commission, so I will briefly note that it's to honor my professional career to serve as the Director of the Division of Swap Dealer and Intermediary Oversight, and in particular I wish to thank the Chairman for the opportunity to serve the United States of America in this capacity. Thank you. On to business then. This morning the Division is presenting for the Commission's consideration 2 proposals. Each proposal takes a targeted approach to addressing an important issue arising from the Commission's margin requirements for swap transactions. The proposals address those issues in a smart, effective, and practical manner. This is consistent with the Commission's overall approach to swaps regulation under the Commodity Exchange Act. The proposals are as follows. First, we have one that would offer entities with smaller levels of swaps activity an additional year to phase in compliance with the Commission's initial margin requirement. Second, a proposal that would exclude, as has been noted, the European Stability Mechanism, or ESM, from the Commission's margin rule. These proposals are designed to reduce the potential for market disruption, provide certainty to market participants, as will be explained further in our presentation to you. As noted earlier, these proposals also further the Commission's overall approach to smart, effective, and practical regulation of the swaps markets. In doing so, they will improve the regulatory experience of market participants that mean to follow our rules. In closing, I wish to recognize the world-class staff in my division who worked hard to prepare these proposals for your consideration today. Deputy Director Tom Smith, Associate Director to my right, Warren Gorlick, Special Counsel Carmen Moncada-Terry, and Rafael Martinez, our Senior Financial Risk Analyst. I also wish to thank Carlene Kim and my law school classmate Paul Schlichting from the Office of General Counsel for their hard work, and Richard Haynes and Stephen Kane in the Office of Chief Economist for their thoughtful insights on these proposals. We wouldn't be here today with these rules in such good shape without their input. I now turn the presentation over to 2 terrific members of our world-class staff, Warren Garlick and Carmen Moncada-Terry. Mr. Gorlick will address the proposal to amend the margin rules and the phase-in timeline for smaller entities. Then, once the Commission has had an opportunity to vote on that matter, Ms. Moncada-Terry will address the ESM proposal. Thank you again, and over to you, Warren.
Thank you, Director. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. As Director Sterling just noted, my name is Warren Gorlick, the Associate Director in DSIO. In addition to Director Sterling, I'm joined today, as Director Sterling also noted, by my colleagues Carmen Moncada-Terry, Special Counsel, and Rafael Martinez, Senior Financial Risk Analyst. Behind me sits Tom Smith, my Deputy Director, who supervised and guided this effort. As Director Sterling just mentioned, but I want to reiterate, we would also like to note the great assistance we received from the Office of General Counsel and the Office of Chief Economist. We are pleased to present this notice of proposed rulemaking that would amend the CFTC's margin rule to extend the compliance schedule for initial margin requirements from September 2020 to September 2021 for firms that have an average daily aggregate amount, which I will refer to here on in as AANA, of uncleared swaps between $8 billion and $50 billion US dollars. By way of background, the CFTC's uncleared margin rules require that swap dealers post and collect initial margin in accordance with the compliance schedule set forth in Commission Regulation 23.161. Currently, the compliance schedule comprises 5 compliance dates staggered across from September 1, 2016 to September 1, 2020, so that swap dealers and their counterparties with the largest AANA come into compliance first, and then successively smaller swap dealers and counterparties come into compliance in later phases. This is a globally coordinated timeline put in place by the Basel Committee for Banking Supervision and IOSCO when they adopted their framework for uncleared margin in 2015. The 4th compliance date, September 1st, 2019, brought within scope of compliance swap dealers and their counterparties exceeding $750 billion in AANA. The Office of Chief Economist has estimated that phases 1 through 4 combined captured just over 40 entities. By contrast, at phase 5, beginning in September 2020, when the threshold for compliance falls from $750 billion to just $8 billion in AANA, this will bring 700 entities into scope, nearly 20 times the number of entities in phases 1 through 4 combined. On a global scale, the number of entities that would come into scope in 2020, absent the extension you are considering today, would be even larger. Mr. Chairman, in your opening remarks, you eloquently described the challenges. So I don't want to belabor the point, but I would just note that the industry has expressed the concerns that given the large number of counterparties prepared to meet the initial margin deadline, these newly in-scope entities may encounter, as you noted, operational difficulties because of the significant number of these entities, which will be engaging the same limited number of service providers to onboard those firms. The potential for compliance delays may lead to disruption in the markets, including the possibility that some counterparties could be temporarily shut out of the uncleared swaps market and therefore unable to hedge the financial risk. In recognition of these challenges, the Basel Committee and IOSCO announced in July 2019 that they were revising the international framework by extending the schedule for compliance with the IM requirements to provide the additional phase-in that you are considering today. For these smaller entities, the compliance date would be September 1st, 2021, rather than September 1st, 2020, and the entities we're discussing are those, again, between $8 billion and $50 billion. Commissioner Berkovitz noted in his opening remarks that while this is a relatively large number of entities, they represent just 3% of total AANA across the 5 phases. This rule amendment is also consistent with the recent proposal under consideration by the U.S. prudential regulators to extend the margin compliance period by 1 year. My understanding is that the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency and the FDIC have already approved the proposal, and the other prudential regulators are in an advanced process of considering it as well. So, from the perspective of staff, we recommend that the Commission issue this NPRM to alleviate the potential for market disruption that may ensue as a result of smaller firms not being able to operationalize the exchange of initial margin and enter into the appropriate documentation in a timely manner to meet Phase 5's compliance deadline. Thank you for your consideration. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you very much to our staff, and particularly to you, Mr. Gorlick, for that informative presentation. To begin the Commission's discussion and consideration of this rulemaking, I'll now entertain a motion to adopt the Division's proposed rule to extend the compliance schedule for the margin rule.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to open the floor for the Commissioners to ask any questions. We'll go in order of seniority. I have just one single question, and that's that I think you've explained very well Basel Committee, IOSCO, our fellow regulators here in the U.S. have all agreed already or proposed to extend the margin for 1 year. Is there any regulator in the world that you are aware of that has said, we're not going to grant the extension?
No,
Okay.
I am not aware. All of the major market jurisdictions, including the CFTC, of course, participate in the working group on margining requirements, and there was a really good international consensus to go forward with this 1 year delay.
Terrific. Thank you. Commissioner Berkovitz? Sorry, yeah, Commissioner Berkovitz will go.
Thank you. So I just want to, so we get the numbers straight. Without relief, the compliance requirements would be for all entities with how much notional value in swaps, and what's the date?
So my understanding is that without relief, there'd be 704 entities, and we took that number comes from the October 2018 study by the Office of Chief Economists. So there would be 704 entities in Phase 5. 542 of those entities will obtain relief if you decide to, well, you just approve
Right.
the rule proposal. So, but if you ultimately adopt the rule proposal, 542 entities will obtain relief, and leaving 162 entities still in scope. Now, as a total of AA and A, as you noted in your remarks, as a percentage, it's 3%. I would have to, in terms of the dollar amounts, let me see if I have that here in the study. Yeah, no, but in terms of, I'm giving it as a percentage, but I
fine,
think
yeah.
what you were asking was
No,
the
it's
total
no,
dollar
No,
amount.
is that,
Yeah.
not the total dollar amount, it was actually the threshold, right,
Yeah.
the threshold, I think, Raphael, yes.
Yes, the threshold is at 8 billion.
Right. So if you lower the threshold down to $8 billion for the requirement on the entities, if they have
Correct.
more than $8 billion in aggregate notional,
Right.
then they would be caught up under the current
Yeah,
current rule without the
Exactly.
extension.
Correct.
So this rule raises that to
$50 billion.
$50 billion. So everybody $50 billion and above is still required to post initial margin as of September 1st, 2020.
That's correct. Everybody between 50 billion and 750 billion will still be subject to the Phase 5 requirements just as they are today. That doesn't change.
And we're providing relief, or the proposed rule would provide relief to that delta there between 8 and 50.
Yes, for
And that-
1 year,
For 1 year, and that's the 3% of the total.
total AA and A, yes.
Now, these requirements, initially, of this schedule that we're under now, that the proposed rule would grant relief from, when we did this, several years ago, was that correct? This schedule was adopted?
Yeah, the commission met, I believe, in December 2015, and the Federal Register release was January 6, 2016. And then the first implementation date under the January 2016 proposal was for the Phase 1 entities. That came into effect on September 1st, 2020. So at that time, industry had approximately 9 months to prepare for the initial margin requirements once the rule was in effect.
Well, when today we're fortunate to have the work done by the Office of Chief Economist, and has provided us with the data that we're basing this relief on in terms of percentages. But when this rule was adopted in 2015, were there estimates of how many people would be affected in the scope of the rule, and anything like that? Who would be affected and
No.
how much?
Sorry. No, there were not. The focus at that time was really on the implementation of a major new requirement to do dual margining on both sides. This was that, so just the technical aspects of getting the rule in place was the focus. It's also the case that industry hadn't yet developed their SIM model that would have made it easier to determine how many entities were in scope. That only came in late 2016 and was more refined in 2017 and 2018. So those numbers just didn't exist at the time the CFTC and the U.S. prudential regulators adopted the rule.
So is it fair to say the original compliance schedule was not based on like a rigorous analysis of who can do what by what date? It was something that they were just relying on the best information and put in this compliance schedule without underlying data as to who could do and how many people would be affected.
Yeah. I wasn't present at the creation, Raphael was, but yes, that's my understanding that the data just didn't exist to do that kind of quantitative impact study.
Right. So I think that's another factor counseling in favor of the proposed rule that we're doing today. We just simply, when we imposed these requirements, we really didn't know. I mean, the information wasn't available. It was a new requirement. We really didn't know exactly what the impact would be on the scope of the entities, the number of entities, and we've subsequently learned, particularly for these smaller entities, these end users, of the burdens, and we've seen we have an idea of what it takes to get these margin requirements in place, the documentation requirements. So I think we have better information now, and again, stressing that this is extremely limited. We're talking about 1 year here. Is that correct? A one-year relief? So,
correct.
I think this is a prudent measure given the burdens on the smaller entities and the end users and trying to get it right. So I think it's prudent for the Commission and the other prudential regulators to go in this direction. Thank you.
Very good points. Thank you for raising them, Commissioner Berkovitz. Commissioner Stump?
I just have one question with regard to this interim phase that's now been created, the folks that will have between $50 billion and $750 billion in AANA. How many do we anticipate would be implicated in this new phase?
So the ones, are you talking about the ones remaining in the new phase? You'll have 542 entities that will now become subject to the margin requirements in September 2021. That's according to the chief economist's study. It will still leave the 162 entities that will have to come into scope as they are under the current requirements in September 2020.
And how does that compare to phases 1 through 4, just relative to the number of entities that were involved?
It's really it's quite dramatically large. Phases 1 through 4 was only 40 firms total, and now you have the 704 entities in either phase 5 or what we sometimes refer to, if you pass this rule proposal, as a phase 6. You would have, between the phase 5 and phase 6, you have 704 entities versus just 40 entities today subject to the requirements. So that's where you get into this thing. Well, it's a relatively large number of entities and the compliance burden is very high, but in terms of total AANA, as Commissioner Berkovitz pointed out, it's relatively small.
And I would add, Commissioner, that speaking of it practically, we would have several hundred market participants trying to enter into and negotiate agreements with a limited number of dealers. And there could be real issues around, frankly, getting face time, if you will, to have conversations about how to do that appropriately, which is why we thought the additional year was a good choice.
Right. Raphael, did you have something?
Yes, thank you. So I would like to note that when we're talking about firms, 40 and 100, we're talking about firms that have multiple subsidiaries interacting with each other, and that it's the burden is not just for each entity, it's for each relationship that they have. So as you expand the number of entities that are captured, if you had 5 entities, there would be 5 times 4 others, right? So when you have hundreds, you have thousands of relationships among them. And so the burden is not linear with the number of entities. And the entities that are still captured in what will be phase 5 to 2020, they're still very large. They have subsidiaries and many relationships that will exceed the $50 million threshold. So even though it seems like the it's a small amount, that the remaining phase 5 versus phase 6, when you look at the count of relationships that will require the repapering, actually the break between phase 5 and phase 6 is much more balanced, because phase 6 is going to have entities that have fewer relationships as they're smaller, and fewer of those relationships will exceed the $50 million. To be clear, there's still plenty of relationships there that in phase 6 that will exceed the $50 million, and those will be margined per the rules as they stand now. But so the break into phase 5 and phase 6 was based on analysis done by ISDA, corroborated by the excellent study of the FCA and of our OCE also. And it is based on numbers that try to distribute the burden across both phases.
Thank you. I do think this is a prudent approach. But I would like to point out that even the new phase 5 is considerably larger than anything we've experienced to date. So thank you all.
Thank you, Commissioner Stump. Any questions or comments from you, Commissioner Benham?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Three quick questions, and then I'd like to make my short statement, which will also be on the website. And in line with Commissioner Berkowitz's point, I think it's important that we sort of extract a lot of the underlying work that went into this proposal, the history, and what's really at stake for both our end user community and the market as a whole. So one, have there ever been alternatives considered to the extension, the one-year extension, or was the extension always sort of the clearly the cleanest path forward, but viewed as the best path forward?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that there were other alternatives. Raphael just mentioned ISDA. ISDA, along with some other trade associations, had proposed at one point, but I think they're comfortable with the approach that the WGMR ultimately took. But at one point, there was a proposal to exempt completely for all time all entities with under $100 billion in AANA. That was considered and reviewed pretty carefully by the WGMR, and Raphael is our member on that. But there simply was never an international consensus to do that. I think, always in those kind of decisions, you're balancing the potential reduction in the compliance burden against how much initial margin is lost. The estimates might be slightly vary on how much initial margin is lost, but even the industry conceded in their studies that a significant amount, maybe relatively small, but still a significant amount of IM would be lost. And so there was never any international consensus to do a $100 billion permanent carve-out.
Okay, thank you. Second question regarding the end users that you or any of you have engaged with over the course of these months and years leading up to today, and I've had some of these conversations as well. I think it's important to note what work has been done, despite the fact that we're here today extending the compliance schedule for a year, which is a short period of time given the percentage and also the number of entities that are engaged. But can we talk a little bit about what you've heard from these entities, this sort of cohort that's in this phase 5 bucket, and what work they've done towards compliance but just have not been able to get quite to the finish line before the original schedule date?
Sure. A couple of things. First, I would note that in response to other concerns, in July of this year, this division, DSIO, put out an advisory that substantially clarified that these documentation requirements and having to set up a custodial relationship, you wouldn't have to do that in the first place unless you've hit a separate threshold that we haven't discussed today, which is $50 million in initial margin. So even when you are in scope, that is presumably because say in phase 4 you've hit 750 billion, you don't have to actually start undertaking the somewhat onerous documentation requirements and set up custodial relationships unless you're at the $50 million level. Now, obviously, you don't wait until you get to 50 million and then say, oh my, I'm here, what do I do? You have to do that before. But that provided, by our estimates, relief to about 2/3 of the counterparty relationships that would otherwise have been in scope. So that alone provided significant relief. This proposal came about because it was viewed as, even though that was significant in itself, there was a feeling that that wasn't quite sufficient, and we had to do a little bit more too. And that goes to Commissioner Stump's point that we do have the 162 entities coming into phase 5 in September 2020, and that is a big gulp. We all acknowledge that, but at least we have the advisory out there that will ameliorate that to some extent. Besides that, yeah, we continue to hear from both the dealers and financial end users. A number at Commissioner Stump's GMAC meeting, there were a number of concerns raised. We hope in the coming months to start addressing as many of those concerns as possible. From the dealers, we speak, as you might imagine, very frequently with the NFA. We consult with them as to how the phase 5 swap dealers are doing in terms of getting their compliance in, and you know, whether they're going to use what we call the standardized table or do a model. We're in close consultation. It sounds like everybody is quite aware of the problem on the swap dealer side. And also, you know, when you go to industry meetings, which I've had the great fortune to do, I mean, you definitely hear the swap dealers telling their counterparties at these meetings, we're going to come to you with questionnaires. You got to tell us if you're going to be in scope or out of scope. We won't know because the financial end users might typically deal with more than one swap dealer. So I think the swap dealers seem to be taking it very seriously and reaching out to their counterparties to try to determine who's going to be in scope, and then with the ones that seem most likely to be in scope, setting up the appropriate documentation and custodial relationships.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Rafael.
Yes, Commissioner, thank you for that question. The WGMR came out with the framework in 2013, I believe, and some might have the impression that how can these people in phase 5 not be ready? Have they been sitting on their hands and all this time? But the reality is that the reform was quite substantial and very complex. This was bringing about processes that were not followed by all parties. While there was a change of margin, it was not by many parties. It was not in this particular form, in this mechanism, this kind of collateral, this timing. The requirements are quite demanding, and industry, most of the burden of the regulations in the U.S. fall on swap dealers. And swap dealers have been preparing for this phase 5 over time, but it has been really like putting together like an international space station, because it required the participation of service providers from custodian banks. By service providers, I should give some examples, is collateral optimizers, people that are going to facilitate the prompt transfer of collateral. There's been a lot of legal firms that have been involved, finding opinions that the agreements can be legally binding and the collateral can be protected in different jurisdictions. There's been a different form. In some countries, the collateral is held in one legal form. To a title transfer that has been changed to be done as a security interest. It's been a very, very heavy lift. They have to learn how to express their risks, in particular forms so that it fits a standard model that has been developed to try to avoid the differences of calculating what somebody's calling for and the other person says, but my number for posting is different. To try to avoid those differences, they develop a standard model that brings about a standardized form of looking at risk. There's been even a crowdsourcing effort to try to classify swaps. What is this swap? Is this the Forex swap? Is this an interest rate swap? Is this, to put, it's the CDS, what category, different buckets to be able to put into the model. So that had been crowdsourced. People couldn't even agree because of the complexity of different rules of what swaps are in or out of the calculation, because different jurisdictions have different contracts in scope. So dealing with all that preparation has been an extraordinary effort, and all that has been happening during the years and in preparation for phase 5. Still some bottlenecks remain that we are worried about, and that's what we're trying to facilitate through this proposal, that with all that has been done, that we can still successfully, without disruption to the market, implement these rules. But it's been constant effort.
Thank you. Finally, one of the core and key responses to the crisis was eliminating and mitigating systemic risk and contagion amongst the entire financial system. So to the extent that you have analyzed this or thought about this within the context of the proposal, do you see any systemic risk or contagion effects because of this rule?
Commissioner Benham, thank you for that question. We do not, given the small number of, the small amount at risk here, and the fact that we're having market participants come into phase for margin in phase 5 now in September 2020. We don't see those concerns.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, in the interest of time, I'm going to just read one small part of my statement, which will emphasize some of the points that the staff made. And again, thank you to all of you for your work. But as I mentioned earlier, my entire statement will be available on the website, if not now, shortly. As proposed, the extension of the compliance schedule for initial margin requirements for an additional year does not alter our expectation that the large number of covered entities will continue to diligently work towards compliance. Whereas our goal with this proposed rulemaking focuses on transition risk, mitigating potential market disruption due largely to the limitations of service providers and related operational burdens, I will personally maintain high expectations that with additional time and a clear demand for services, participants and the entities they engage will focus resources on compliance as opposed to future relief. Thanks again to all of you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Benham. Commissioner Quintens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Josh, Warren, Carmen, Raphael for your hard work on this proposal. I know it's been a constant amount of work, and you've put in a lot of thought and effort into this entire phasing process, and I'm very appreciative of it. I do feel a little compelled to make a point, which is that initial margin has been kind of a staple of the derivative space, the clear derivative space in particular, to mitigate counterparty credit risk. But as we have made a policy choice to extend that into the uncleared space, there's always a trade-off. And that trade-off is increased liquidity risk. And so while we are mitigating counterparty credit risk, we are increasing liquidity risk. And liquidity risk can lead to defaults. Is that correct?
Yes.
It would seem to me like the entities that will have the hardest time dealing with liquidity risk are the ones that are fully invested, such as insurance companies and pension plans. Do we have any estimate as to the number of pension plans specifically that is still included in this 162 number of entities that is remaining in phase 5 that will have to abide by these new rules within 11 months?
Okay, so I just got from the chief economist, he pointed me to the right part of the study. Of all the Phase 5 entities, insurance companies are 48. So recall that there were 704 Phase 5 entities total. So 48 of those are insurance companies, and pension funds are 54.
Okay. Okay. And as we impose this trade-off on these firms between mitigating counterparty credit risk and increasing their liquidity risk, that also means that we are likely forcing them to reduce their exposure to their investments and their portfolios, which will therefore probably increase their returns or expected returns.
Yes, Commissioner, yeah, this was a thought early on in the original proposal, and the final proposal expanded the types of collateral that can be posted. So it was responsive to comments by pension funds and insurance companies. They also have the right to request segregation, even of their variation margin. Mm-hmm. So, okay, that's off topic, but initial margin segregation is segregated. But we expanded precisely because of liquidity concerns, was the initial margin threshold, trying to reduce the number of entities that would need to exchange margin. Those that still have exposures exceeding the $50 million threshold will be able to post assets that typically they would have in their portfolio. And we're hoping that that would mitigate the liquidity risk. But you are absolutely correct that that's the trade-off, and that is one of the concerns that the Commission considered when finalizing the original rule.
Thank you for that, Rafael. I think that's a very important point, that this does contain some increased proposed flexibility. I'd be very interested in comments around how that can or may not go as far as some like in mitigating some of that liquidity risk. So thank you for providing that clarity. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And any other questions? Okay, are the commissioners prepared to vote? If so, Mr. Kirkpatrick, will you please call the roll?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The motion now before the Commission is on the approval of the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking on the Compliance Schedule Extension Amendment to Regulation 23.161. Commissioner Berkovitz.
Aye.
Commissioner Berkovitz votes aye. Commissioner Stump.
Aye.
Commissioner Stump votes aye. Commissioner Benham.
Aye.
Commissioner Benham votes aye. Commissioner Quintens.
Aye.
Commissioner Quintens votes aye. Chairman Tarbert.
Aye.
Chairman Tarbert votes aye. Mr. Chairman, on this matter, the ayes have 5, the noes have 0.
The ayes have it, and the motion to adopt the proposed rule is approved. At this time, I'd like to invite a second presentation on a proposed rule that would exclude the European Stability Mechanism from margin requirements from uncleared swaps.
Good morning. I am Carmen Moncada Terry, Special Counsel in the Division of Swap Dealer and Intermediary Oversight, or DSIO. In addition to Director Sterling, I am joined by my colleagues Warren Gorlick, Associate Director, and Rafael Martinez, Senior Financial Risk Analyst. I also want to recognize the invaluable assistance we received from the Office of the General Counsel, the Office of the Chief Economist, and the Office of International Affairs. Today, we are pleased to present a notice of proposed rulemaking that will amend the CFTC margin rule to add the European Stability Mechanism to the list of entities that are excluded from the definition of financial end user, and will thus codify a no-action letter issued by DSIO in 2017. The proposal will also correct a typographical error in Commission Regulation 23-157. Swap dealers and major swap participants are registered with the Commission and are subject to the CFTC margin rule are required to post and collect variation and initial margin with other swap dealers and major swap participants, in addition to financial end users. The term financial end user is defined in Commission Regulation 23-151 and excludes certain specified entities such as sovereign entities and multilateral development banks. The proposal will add the European Stability Mechanism to the list of entities that are excluded from the definition of financial end user. As a result, swaps of the European Stability Mechanism with swap dealers and major swap participants subject to the CFTC margin rule will be exempt from the CFTC variation and initial margin requirements. DSIO staff recommends that the Commission issue this notice of proposed rulemaking. Staff notes that the NPRM, consistent with the 2017 no action letter, will relieve swap transactions between the European Stability Mechanism and swap dealer counterparties from the CFTC initial margin and variation margin requirements. As a result, swap dealer counterparties will bear the risk of uncollateralized exposure to the European Stability Mechanism. However, staff believes that providing an exemption from variation and initial margin requirements for swap transactions entered into by the European Stability Mechanism is warranted because the European Stability Mechanism is an intergovernmental financial institution established by the European Union that supports member states in financial distress with the ultimate goal of managing and reducing risk to the European financial system. Moreover, the European Stability Mechanism's credit profile is similar to that of entities such as multilateral development banks that are already excluded from the definition of financial end user and whose swaps are not subject to the CFTC margin rule. In summary, the European Stability Mechanism, like multilateral development banks, poses less risk to their swap dealer counterparties and to the overall financial system. It is therefore reasonable to treat the European Stability Mechanism and clear swaps similarly to those of multilateral development banks and not require variation and initial margin for those swaps. Thank you for your attention. We will be happy to discuss any questions you may have.
Thank you very much to our staff, and particularly to you, Ms. Moncada-Terry, for that yet another informative presentation. At this point, I'll entertain a motion to approve the division's proposed rulemaking related to the margin requirements for unclear swaps relating to the European Stability Mechanism.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. I'd now like to open the floor for commissioners to ask any questions. We'll start with you, Commissioner Quintens.
I don't have any questions, Mr. Chairman, but if this is the right point to give a statement, I'll do that.
Please.
Okay. First of all, thank you, Carmen, for the presentation, and thank you to the division for your work. In March of 2018, I articulated my approach to our current regulatory relationship with our European counterparts in light of their refusal to stand by or reaffirm the commitments they made in the 2016 cross-border CCP agreement. Specifically, the absence of the agreement's reaffirmation, in my opinion, directly implied the agreement's abrogation by MIR 2.2. I therefore vowed that I would either object to or vote against any relief provided to or requested by EU authorities until the agreement's clarity was restored. And let me say that while the possibility, I think, certainly exists for a successful outcome to the implementation of a MIR 2.2 that ultimately fully respects the CFTC's ultimate authority over U.S. CCPs, still no assurance has been given to remove that doubt. So I therefore dissent from today's proposed rule to exempt the ESM from the Commission's margin requirements for uncleared swaps. The ESM plays an important role within Europe, an intergovernmental organization of the EU's Eurozone member states that provides financial assistance to those countries. The rule the CFTC is proposing to issue today would codify CFTC staff no-action relief, permitting the ESM, unlike other financial entities, to enter into uncleared swaps with commission-registered swap dealers without complying with the CFTC's margin requirements. In proposing this rule, the CFTC has directed precious staff resources to provide legal certainty to an EU agency so that it may access CFTC-supervised swap dealers with significantly greater flexibility than we provide to U.S. firms. Yet we are taking this step while, and as I stated at last month's GMAC meeting, the proposed implementation of EMIR 2.2 has actually increased the likelihood of the CCP agreement's nullification. At this point, I believe it is entirely unclear whether or not any of the 5 U.S. CCPs currently authorized to access the EU will ultimately be treated as domestic EU firms and forced to follow EU rules. Subjecting a U.S. CCP to the same level of EU regulation as an EU CCP would unilaterally render null and void an agreement originally based on regulatory deference and mutual respect between 2 authorities. Even subjecting those 5 CCPs to a reapplication process under a new or different set of criteria could, in my opinion, nullify that agreement. And yet that reapplication process is precisely the current set of expectations. The CFTC, EC, CCP agreement promoted cross-border markets and regulatory efficiency because the CFTC and the European Commission agreed on where and how to appropriately defer to each other's regulatory regimes. A rule like the one proposed today, or the relief provided by CFTC staff to Eurex Clearing last December, and to which I similarly objected, provides special accommodations to EU institutions by relying on the CFTC's trust in EU counterparts. I believe that in the current environment, such trust continues to be misplaced until the EU can provide us assurances that the CCP agreement will be upheld. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Quintens. Commissioner Benham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll have a few questions, and then I'd just like to make a point about the proposal. It's a little bit of a comparison to the prudential regulators and how they treat ESM specifically within their rule set. Can you elaborate on that?
They haven't given any similar relief to the ESM. Swaps that are overseen by the prudential regulators involving the ESM are subject to the margin requirements, the prudential margin requirements. It is possible that in applying their supervisory discretion, that the prudential regulators on a one-on-one basis, on an individual basis, swap by swap, they might be giving some relief, but we don't know.
Just wanted to add that the prudential regulators, they follow the Basel standards, and under the Basel standards, the ESM is listed as an entity with the lowest risk weight, 0. And so at least for their capital purposes, they consider this a counterparty that poses no risk. I'm not sure even applying the margin rule, and as you know, margin and capital are the dynamic duo. They always try to be in agreement. If how they apply the margin rules, given that perceived inconsistency between the capital treatment and the margin treatment.
So it sounds like despite the sort of technical inconsistencies, you don't see any concerns that we treat ESM differently than the prudentials. We believe that
Given the nature of the ESM's operations, their main goal is managing and mitigating, reducing risk to the financial system. Yeah. And also they have been assigned risk weight of 0 by Basel. And also they have the full backing, explicit backing of highly rated sovereigns as recognized by the global capital regime. Okay. So we believe that our approach is consistent. Again, as I mentioned, it is possible that on individual cases, they might be giving them relief. They might be applying their supervisory discretion, but we don't know.
So can you elaborate a little bit on the types of swaps exposure ESM has, given the sort of zero risk categorization it's gotten? But can you just talk a little bit about fundamentally the role it plays and what types of swaps exposure it engages?
No formal study has been conducted. What we understand basically, and this is very superficially, on the review of this SDR information, is that they have their activity is relatively small as it concerns swaps. With our swaps with our entities.
I would add that as the proposing release articulates, Mr. Commissioner, that the activity is sort of related to financing the undertaking in the capital markets, so one could be led to believe that would include things like rate swaps and so forth. So they're financing their bailout activities, if you will, in the capital markets and entering into swaps in connection with that.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions I have. I do want to thank all of you, Carmen, specifically for your work on this proposal. I think it's worth noting that in the proposal there are two mentions of sort of international comedy and what fundamentally we're doing within the context of this proposal and how it relates to our international counterparts. Both in the main text of the proposal mentions how the Commission believes this proposal will encourage international comedy and continued cooperation between the Commission and the EU. And then more specifically within the cost-benefit analysis, and I'd like to read a quick sentence within the public interest consideration, says, quote, "The Commission believes that the proposed amendment to Commission Regs 23151 is also warranted based on the interest of comedy and the Commission's continuing cross-border coordination with EU authorities, such as the 2016 EC CFTC agreement, which Commissioner Quintens mentioned earlier, which has fostered cooperation and mutual respect between the CFTC and EU authorities." So that all said, I think it's important, and I want to commend the chairman for bringing this up. As I mentioned in my opening statement, I think it's important as a matter of housekeeping we codify and finalize our no action relief, which this has existed for a while now. But we must act in a measured way. We must work as we have historically as a commission to engage with our international counterparts and make sure that the deference that we're providing is also provided to us. So I look forward to the public comments, and as I mentioned earlier, I'll be supporting this, but certainly look forward to the weeks and months ahead as we continue to deal with a unique international environment within financial markets, given all that's going on across the globe. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Benham. Commissioner Stump.
Thank you all. I don't have any questions, but just building on something that Commissioner Quintens and Commissioner Benham noted, the proposal does take note that reciprocity is a valid consideration here. And I just wanted to, state that, reciprocity can take on many forms. It can be recognizing comparable regulations across global jurisdictions, or it can be retribution in the form of extraterritoriality application of one jurisdiction's regulations to another. I prefer the former, but if forced and our own regulations are disrespected, I have no problem moving to the latter. So I suggest that as something just for our colleagues to consider, and that this is an effort on our part to respect their jurisdiction, and I hope that it will be reciprocated to our own jurisdiction. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Stump. Commissioner Berkovitz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have the benefit of having all the points that I was going to make having been said by all my fellow commissioners, but I'm going to say them again anyway, just to emphasize some of the points. This relief codifies an existing no-action letter. That's correct. Could you just state for the record what the current no-action letter does?
Sorry. Basically, it relieves swaps entered into by the ESM and swap dealers and major swap participants subject to our jurisdiction from our margin requirements.
And how long has this been in place, approximately?
Since July 2017.
2007. Has there been any issue or problem that has arisen because
Not
of
that we are
this?
aware
No,
of.
excellent. And what are some, you've made reference to some of the other entities. There are other entities, European entities, that also are given the sovereign treatment and believed to these requirements. Could you just identify some of those additional entities that have this type of relief, European entities, sovereign entities?
Well, there's no action letter concerning any other entities. Our rule explicitly provides relief, excludes from the financial end user definition the Bank for International Settlement. It also excludes sovereign entities as defined by the rule. Multilateral development banks, which is a defined term in the rule. So those other entities may be captured by those definitions.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to, for a moment, talk about some of the points that have been made about comedy. And Commissioner Benham actually read some of the language on comedy, and Commissioner contends you made the point, and Commissioner Stump. You also talked about the consequences of comedy, and let me read the all-knowing source of information, Wikipedia, the definition of comedy. In law, comedy is, quote, a practice among different political entities as countries, states, or courts of different jurisdictions involving the, quote, mutual recognition of legislative, executive, and judicial acts, unquote. It's mutual recognition. So when we talk about comedy, this is something that inherently is supposed to be mutual. So if I could just sum it up colloquially, comedy is a two-way street. We just don't give comedy, and it's not something that we do unilaterally. It's something that comes in the other direction, too. There's one view of international law that international law is essentially an oxymoron in itself. There's no such thing in international law. The international law is just the law of the jungle. It's might makes right. Everybody's acting in their own self-interest, and you make compromises only when it's your own self-interest, and everybody's out for maximal self-benefit. And if somebody steps out of line, you whack them, and that's the way you get cooperation. I think we've seen throughout history that if you really take that to the extreme, that leads to a lot of conflict, and we've seen a lot of human life lost by nations acting solely in their own interest and trying to maximize everything on the international stage. And I think we've evolved, especially in terms of financial markets. We've got extremely good working relationships with regulators around the globe. The global financial system is improved a lot since the financial crisis because regulators working together and not just trying to extract their own national self-interest to the maximum extent possible. And there has been a lot of comedy and reciprocation and working together and trust built. We've seen, though, however, recently that some of the progress we've made, there's been several steps backwards. And we're seeing that with what's going on in Europe and the legislation taking some steps back from our 2016 agreement. So the question is how do we respond? I mean, and one view is, everything is tit for tat. If they, take a step back, we take a step back. I think we have to calibrate our response. I think we have to make it clear that comedy is a two-way street, and we're not just going to give this out. In terms of how we act in response, I think that's something we here need to think about and deliberate on and take appropriate responses. I would like to see, for example, that we would have built in to some of our regulatory framework this concept. When we did Dodd-Frank initially, we talked about comedy and say, sort of with the expectation that it would be, where everybody's going to be giving comedy back and forth. And we haven't really seen that actualized to the full extent as I think it should be. So I'd like to see baked into our regulatory framework going forward this concept that comedy is a two-way street. We're not just going to give it out, and if on the other side it's not coming back, then that's going to have consequences that it's not going to be forthcoming. So I think we need to bake it in so it doesn't look like we're just acting out of pique or retaliating every time, and it puts us in a position where we have to react to everything in a manner of revoking something. I think it should be, what we granting should be conditional on things coming back as well. So I would encourage us as we go forward. We talked about this in the this concept came up in the DCO alt DCO rule that we considered this past summer, where we were talking about recognizing other regulatory frameworks for DCO and substituted compliance, and I think it would be beneficial if we started baking this concept that comity is a two-way street into our grants of substituted compliance, into our granting of comity.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. We understand and appreciate that point of view.
Thank you very much. No, I just want to echo many of the comments that have been said by my fellow commissioners. I think in my statement that I've issued on the website today, I've used the phrase deference is a two-way street. I think we want to set the example. I think Commissioner Benham actually raised an excellent point in the colloquy that he had with all of you, that in formalizing our relief, proposing to formalize our relief to the ESM, we're actually going beyond even what our federal banking regulators have done. And again, I think we want to set the tone and set the standard for showing and demonstrating good faith on behalf of the Commission. But we'll obviously take into account all of your concerns as we move forward, and this idea that reciprocity may need to be built in to some of the things that we're going to be voting on in the next several months. So very much appreciate all of your comments. We want to make sure that comedy does not turn into comedy, to put it slightly, in that phrase. So are there any more comments from any of my fellow commissioners or questions? Okay, well, are the commissioners prepared to vote? Okay. Well, if so, Mr. Kirkpatrick, will you please call the roll?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The motion now before the Commission is on the approval of the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking on amendments to the margin rule for uncleared swaps related to the European Stability Mechanism. Commissioner Berkovitz.
Aye.
Commissioner Berkovitz votes aye. Commissioner Stump.
Aye.
Commissioner Stump votes aye. Commissioner Benham.
Aye.
Commissioner Benham votes aye. Commissioner Quintens.
No.
Commissioner Quintens votes no. Chairman Tarbert.
Aye.
Chairman Tarbert votes aye. Mr. Chairman, on this matter, the ayes have 4, the noes have 1.
The ayes have it, and the motion to approve the proposed rule carries. Before we move on to closing statements, is there any other commission business? Okay, seeing none, I'd like to give my fellow commissioners an opportunity to make closing statements. We'll start with you, Commissioner Berkovitz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank you for your commitment to public meetings and public dialogue, as well as private meetings and private dialogue. I found our discussions on the issues we've talked about today, as well as other issues, very beneficial, and that accompanied with this commitment to do the publics and business in public, I'm very supportive and appreciative of that. So I have no further comments. I think today proposed rules will advance the agency's mission, and I'm pleased to support them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Commissioner Stump?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to DSIO and everyone else, OGC, OCE, everyone who worked to get these rules before us, and I am pleased to support both of them. I just wanted to say, I typically say this, I've said this at many meetings, that we're all reminded when we have these meetings that during the unfortunate events of the financial crisis, that global regulators around the world committed to a common set of principles and moving forward together in unison in an attempt to ensure that we were strengthening the global derivatives markets, and I think it's always important to remind ourselves of that. Oftentimes, what is left out of the conversation is the element of the G20 directive in Pittsburgh in 2009 that suggested that regulators around the world should constantly reassess how the implementation is going and is it achieving its goal. And I think that's what we've done here today. So thanks to all of you for helping us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Benham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not much else to say that hasn't been said already. Two very important rules. Thanks to the staff, DSIO, OCE, OGC for all your work. As Commissioner Stump said, these are very critical rules that we did today. They may seem small, but in the larger concept of 2009 and the reforms that were made at the G20, they're very significant. So look forward to future meetings. And I might add, since Commissioner Berkovitz brought out his Nats gear, after the Yankees defeat the Astros, there might be some new paraphernalia up here, but we'll see.
It seems like our disagreements, we don't have many, but when we do, it sounds like we should probably veer away from baseball because there may be very different hats worn by the various members of the commission. Commissioner Quintens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for today's open meeting. Thank you to the staff and DSIO for your great work on these two proposals, even notwithstanding my dissent on one of them, to General Counsel's office and Chief Economist's office. Thank you for all of your work. And maybe to echo Commissioner Stump's statement, a lot of work has gone into today, but there's much more work to do, not only on these rules, but to continuously monitor and reevaluate agreements that have already been made. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And before I adjourn the meeting, I have a couple of announcements to make about an exciting set of events just around the corner. First, we're hosting our annual second FinTech Forward Conference right here in this room next Thursday. I understand tickets have already sold out, but we'll be webcasting the entire program on cftc.gov for those of you who can't attend. As I've said before, FinTech holds great promise for our economy, and this event is focused on how we can realize that promise. Second, next week we'll also be hosting our 27th annual International Regulator Symposium. This program will bring together regulators from 49 jurisdictions from around the world. So getting to the points that we've all been making about the G20 and even beyond and international regulatory cooperation, right here at the CFTC in Washington, 49 jurisdictions will be represented. So I look forward to participating in these two events with many of you and my fellow commissioners. There being no further business, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting.
So moved.
Second.
Those in favor of adjourning the meeting will say aye. Aye. Those opposed? The ayes have it. Again, I'm very grateful to the CFTC staff for your great work on these two rules. This meeting is hereby adjourned. Thank you very much.